Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're about to unpack a truly monumental era in world history, spanning roughly from the early 1700s right up to, well, the turn of the millennium in 2000. We're looking at the complex, often difficult path towards what's broadly termed modernization, and critically, the profound and, frankly, disruptive impact that journey had on indigenous peoples right across the globe.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we're navigating a really rich collection of source material. We've got core text excerpts that kind of lay out the concepts in the historical sweep.
Okay.
Then there are these incredibly detailed timelines mapping key events across, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, Pacific Islands. Gives us that global perspective.
Right, seeing it all side by side.
Exactly. And some really powerful illustrative images from the period, too. They offer these glimpses into the cultural interactions, the different worldviews. It's quite something.
So our mission today, basically, is to sift through all of this, pull out those essential insights, maybe some surprising details, and really try to understand the deep connections between these huge forces like European industrialization, global expansion, the collision of very different cultural perspectives on things like land, resources,
fundamental differences,
and the long, often painful, ongoing struggle for recognition and rights by indigenous populations who, let's face it, bore the brunt of so much of this change.
It's a story that really forces you to look beyond simple narratives, doesn't it? You have to appreciate the multi-layered reality of this whole transformative period.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The sources seem to point towards something fundamental happening back in Europe, right around the start of our timeline, the 1700s, as a major catalyst, the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. You have to think of the Industrial Revolution not just as, new machines like steam engines, but as a complete seismic shift in how societies produced things, organized labor, even how they thought about wealth and value.
Right, not just factories.
No, much bigger. And this created immense new demands. Demands for raw materials on a scale never seen before, demands for new markets to sell all the manufactured goods flooding out of these factories, and, crucially, demand for control over the resources land, water needed for industry, and for feeding growing populations back home.
And the sources explicitly connect this, don't they? Linking it directly to European powers beginning to push outwards, colonize parts of the Americas, Asia, South Africa. It wasn't just exploration for glory anymore, was it?
No, it was fundamentally economically driven expansion on a massive scale. And the sources describe this shift in mindset, especially among the settlers moving into these new territories. They call it the bourgeois mentality.
Bourgeois mentality, okay. What does that entail exactly, according to the sources?
It's this view that sees the natural world, land, rivers, forests, even the animals living there, primarily through the lens of commodities. Things to be owned, bought, sold, fenced off.
Measured and valued in monetary terms.
Precisely. Exploited for economic gain. That was the driving force.
Which, as the sources are really quick to point out, was just utterly foreign to the native peoples these Europeans were encountering.
Completely. The sources really emphasize this point. For indigenous cultures, the whole notion of owning the land or claiming exclusive rights to hunt certain animals or fish in a particular river, it just didn't exist in the same way.
So how do they see it then?
Their relationship was based more on stewardship, reciprocity, often deep spiritual connection, not commodification. Exchange certainly happened, but the sources often describe it, at least initially, as more like reciprocal gift-giving, rooted in social bonds, not market-driven trade purely for profit.
And the material is quite clear that at least early on, these native communities had no real desire to just drop everything and join the mainstream of European culture, adopting this completely different way of life.
No, why would they? Their systems worked for them within their environment and worldview.
So this immediately sets up a fundamental clash in worldviews, doesn't it? The sources touch on this idea of competing notions of civilization. Europeans often saw themselves as the pinnacle, the arbiters of civilization, and viewed others as uncivilized, which conveniently served as a justification for imposing their own systems and, well, taking land.
It was a very powerful narrative tool for the colonizers, that civilizing mission idea. But here's where the sources offer a really fascinating nuance, something that maybe challenges that simple narrative. The sources include these images. They specifically mention Central African statuary influencing Western artists like J. Lipchitz, the sculptor.
Oh, yes, I think I saw that reference. And Japanese Zen paintings?
Exactly. Japanese Zen paintings inspiring American abstract expressionism back in the 1920s. These images are right there in the text discussing civilization.
Okay, so what's the implication of putting those images there?
Well, it seems to challenge that whole idea of a purely one-way flow of culture, doesn't it? While the dominant power dynamic was clearly European imposition, these images, drawn directly from our source material, show there was a more complex cultural interaction happening, maybe under the surface.
So even while officially labeling these cultures uncivilized.
Western artists were clearly deeply influenced, inspired by their forms, their aesthetics, their philosophies. It subtly undermines that simplistic civilized versus uncivilized binary that the Europeans themselves were using to justify their actions. It shows the inherent richness and, frankly, the appeal of these non-European artistic traditions.
That's a really important detail. It adds a layer of complexity, suggesting it wasn't just about brute force or economic dominance. There was this unacknowledged, or maybe selectively acknowledged, cultural flow happening too. The sources also describe the nature of the very early interactions, say, in North America. They started quite differently from how things ultimately played out.
They do. Early European traders, the French and Spanish, get specific mentions, often found native peoples, initially at least, quite welcoming and willing to engage. The Spanish, of course, were driven largely by the search for wealth, finding gold in the south,
Right, the conquistadors.
while the French, further north, were primarily focused on the lucrative fur and fish trade. Different motivations, different areas.
But the sources detail how this relationship, this exchange, shifted quite rapidly. What might have started with elements of mutual benefit, or maybe even based on indigenous traditions of gift-giving.
It quickly transformed into trade, driven purely by European market value and the pursuit of profit.
Yeah.
This is where that clash in mentalities becomes really stark and damaging. The sources emphasize that native peoples often didn't grasp the abstract market value that Europeans placed on goods like furs or fish back in Europe. How could they?
So they'd exchange valuable resources.
For relatively trivial European items in return, or for goods whose true cost, like dependency or social disruption, wouldn't become clear for generations. This relentless commercial focus, this drive for maximum profit from the European side, inevitably led to increasing greed.
And that greed, understandably, bred fear and suspicion among the native populations, didn't it? Which then led to conflict.
It poisoned the relationship. The sources list some of the specific goods introduced by Europeans. Firearms, which shifted power balances dramatically, alcohol, which had devastating social effects, blankets, sometimes carrying diseases, iron vessels, useful but displacing traditional crafts. Some are practical, yes, but others were incredibly destructive.
And there's a specific point made about tobacco addiction.
Yes, the sources explicitly mention that natives acquired an addiction to tobacco through this exchange, which highlights that beyond just the economic exploitation, these interactions brought significant social and health consequences, demonstrating the unequal and often harmful nature of the exchange right from its early stages.
So just to recap that early phase, the sources paint this picture of European expansion, fueled by industrial needs and this commodity-driven mindset, colliding head-on with diverse indigenous cultures, holding fundamentally different relationships with land and resources.
Right.
And this clash, intensified by European greed, quickly turns what might have been wary exchanges into outright conflict and exploitation.
And introduced goods and substances that had complex, often deeply damaging long-term effects on native societies. It set a pattern.
Now, the sources also reveal that this whole process of European imperialism wasn't monolithic. It wasn't a single uniform approach applied everywhere across the globe.
Right.
It adapted, it took different forms depending on the place and the goals.
That's a really crucial distinction the material makes. It wasn't always about marching in, planting a flag, and taking over the government directly. Sometimes European powers exerted control primarily by exploiting a country's resources or manipulating its markets without actually dismantling the existing state structures entirely.
How would they do that?
Well, they might prop up local rulers who were compliant or create complex systems of indirect influence through advisors, debt, or unequal treaties, control without the full burden of administration.
But then, in other cases, it was about direct political control, establishing colonies, imposing European administration, judges, laws.
Yes. And then there was a third category, the settler colonies. This is where large numbers of Europeans actually came to live permanently with the explicit intention of displacing the existing population and creating a new society that mirrored their homeland, a New England, a New France.
Okay, so three broad types: indirect exploitation, direct colonial rule, and settler colonialism. The sources give
You
examples.
do. British rule in India is often presented as a complex form of colonial control, maybe starting with economic motives via the East India Company and evolving into direct rule, but distinct in its mechanisms from, say, 19th century Australia.
Which the sources describe as.
A prime example of a settler colony. The goal was settlement, displacing the Aboriginal population and building a European society.
So India versus Australia represents two different models highlighted in the sources. What about that first type, the exploitation without direct rule? Any key examples there?
China is pointed to as a key example. The sources discuss the British actions leading up to and during the Opium Wars. These wars were fought explicitly to force China to open its markets to trade, including, most notoriously, the highly addictive opium grown in British India.
So forcing trade through military might.
Exactly. But it wasn't just Britain meddling. The sources note that Russia, America, and Japan also got involved, carving out spheres of influence, demanding concessions, and generally meddling in Chinese affairs without establishing formal, widespread colonial rule across the whole country.
And this constant interference, this economic pressure, these unequal treaties, they had a profound impact on China's sovereignty.
Absolutely. So much so that the sources use a really potent term to describe China's status during this period.
Which is?
They describe China as being reduced to the status of a semi-colony.
Semi-colony.
Yeah. It captures that ambiguous state of being nominally independent, having its own government, but having lost significant control over its economic policies, its tariffs, its ports, even parts of its legal system, due to external imperial pressure. It's a less visible form of control, perhaps, than direct annexation, but it could be just as debilitating to national autonomy and development.
It really highlights how complex and varied the toolkit of imperial power actually was. It wasn't just one method.
No, it adapted to circumstances.
And the sources even show us how this European influence is embedded right down to the level of language in the very names we use for places today.
It's a subtle but incredibly pervasive legacy, isn't it? The source material mentions how continents and countries ended up with names reflecting European explorers or their naming conventions. America, for instance, derived from Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian explorer. Canada is an interesting one. It actually comes from Kanata, a Huron-Iroquois word meaning village or settlement. So that's a rare instance where an indigenous word was adopted, although still within that European framework of naming the whole territory.
Right. What about Australia?
That comes from the Latin australis,
Yeah.
simply meaning southern, a very European map-based perspective. And New Zealand was named by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman after a province back in the Netherlands, Zeeland, with Z meaning sea.
So these names, recorded right there in the sources, they act almost like linguistic markers, don't they? Reminders of that moment of European arrival, that assertion of presence, often overlaying or completely replacing the names indigenous peoples had used for millennia.
A constant reminder of that initial encounter and the power dynamics involved.
Okay, so we've established the driving forces industrialization, the commodity mindset. We've seen the clashing worldviews, the different forms imperialism took. Now let's really focus on what the sources highlight as a central, perhaps the central human consequence of this entire era, the widespread displacement of indigenous peoples. The sources dedicate a significant portion to this, particularly focusing on the Americas and Australia.
Yes, this is arguably the most direct and devastating human cost documented in these sources, linked directly to that path towards modernization and expansion as defined by Europeans. Theme 6 in the material specifically details how Native peoples in America and Australia were quite literally pushed out of their ancestral lands.
Who pushed them out?
European settlers, driven by that relentless desire for land and resources we talked about.
Okay, let's begin with the Americas, specifically North America, as described in the sources. The sources first paint this picture of the sheer scale and richness of the continent's geography.
They do. Stretching from the Arctic ice fields way down to the Pacific coast, encompassing immense mountain ranges like the Rockies and Appalachians, vast central plains, the Great Lakes, intricate networks of rivers, an incredibly diverse landscape.
And beneath all that, immense natural resources.
Absolutely. Coal, oil, natural gas, various minerals, vast forests for timber, and huge tracts of fertile land, just perfect for the kind of large-scale agriculture Europeans practice, a continent of staggering natural wealth.
Which the incoming Europeans viewed primarily through that lens of.
Resource extraction and settlement, potential farms, mines, timber stands. The sources then give us the deep history perspective. The ancestors of Native Americans arrived on this continent over 30,000 years ago.
30,000 years. That's incredible context.
Isn't it? crossing the Bering Strait land bridge from Asia, gradually migrating south over millennia. Their populations eventually stabilized around 5,000 years ago. And in that immense span of time, they developed incredibly diverse ways of life, adapting brilliantly to vastly different environments, from the Arctic tundra to the southwestern deserts to the eastern woodlands.
And speaking hundreds of distinct languages.
Hundreds. The sources estimate hundreds, which really underscores the incredible cultural variation that existed before European arrival. These weren't monolithic Indians, they were hundreds of distinct peoples and nations.
So how did they live? What was their lifestyle like, according to the sources?
It involved a complex mix, depending on the region: hunting, fishing, gathering wild plants and foods, and in many areas, sophisticated forms of gardening or agriculture, think corn, beans, squash in the east and southwest. And a crucial aspect the sources mention repeatedly is the principle of sharing resources within their communities and often with neighboring groups.
Communal use, not private hoarding.
Exactly. There's a quote included from William McLeish that really captures this sense of interconnectedness and flexibility. He describes how the landscape spoke at every hand, diversity open to them, combination of pursuits, shared, open to them. It evokes a very different relationship with the environment, adaptable, communal, deeply tied to place.
And their methods evolved too, like using horses.
Right. A famous example is how Plains tribes acquired horses, originally brought by the Spanish, and masterfully adapted them to hunt the vast bison herds. This became absolutely central to the culture and survival of many Plains peoples, a major adaptation facilitated by an introduced element.
Okay, now here's where it gets, as you said, really fundamental. And the sources keep coming back to it. That completely different, totally irreconcilable view of land.
This wasn't just a minor disagreement over boundaries, it was the absolute core conflict that fueled the displacement. The sources state it unequivocally. For Native peoples, every part of the earth was sacred. The very concept of owning land as private property, dividing it up with fences and deeds, and selling it for money, it was alien. It was incomprehensible.
And this is where that attributed quote from Chief Seattle comes in, right?
Yeah.
Sources included.
Yes, and whether it's his exact words or a later reconstruction, the sentiment it expresses perfectly captures that indigenous perspective highlighted in the sources. How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. It speaks volumes about that sacred connection to the earth, the water, the air, the ancestors buried in the soil. It's not a commodity, it's kin, it's identity.
It's a profound statement, and it stands in such stark, direct contrast to that European bourgeois mentality focused on property, profit, and fences.
Totally incompatible worldviews, essentially. And the sources detail precisely how this clash played out, tragically, in the process of displacement across the USA. Land was acquired by the U.S. government and settlers through various means. Often, it involved treaties.
But these treaties, were they fair?
The sources strongly suggest otherwise. They point out these treaties were frequently negotiated under duress, with massive power imbalances. Sometimes translations were poor or deliberately misleading. Often the prices offered for vast territories were shockingly low or payments weren't made. And when treaties failed or were simply ignored by settlers hungry for land,
Then came force.
then came outright force, military campaigns, violent suppression of resistance.
The sources highlight the case of the Cherokee Nation as a particularly awful example of this injustice.
It really does. It starkly illustrates the disregard for Native rights, even when those rights had been theoretically legally recognized by the U.S. system itself. The sources note that in 1832, the U.S. Chief Justice John Marshall actually recognized the Cherokee Nation as a distinct political community, a domestic dependent nation with rights to its territory in the Southeast.
A Supreme Court ruling. That should have protected them, shouldn't it?
You would think so. But their lands were fertile, gold had been discovered there, and white settlers wanted it. The political will, driven by President Andrew Jackson, was for removal, regardless of the court.
And Jackson just ignored the Supreme Court.
Explicitly rejected the judgment, according to the sources. He pushed forward with the Indian Removal Act policies, which led to the forced removal of around 15,000 Cherokee people from their ancestral homelands.
Trail of Tears.
That brutal forced march westward under military guard became known as the Trail of Tears. The sources grimly state that approximately a quarter of the Cherokee people, thousands of men, women, and children, perished during the journey from disease, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. It's just a harrowing example of legal rights being utterly overridden by political power and the relentless demand for land.
The sources also touch on the prevailing attitude among many Europeans in the 19th century, this idea that native peoples were primitive and, frankly, expected to just die out.
Yes, this sort of pseudo-scientific racism and belief in inevitable progress served as a convenient justification for taking their land and destroying their way of life. It allowed Europeans to dismiss their complex societies and deep connection to the land.
Their skills were ignored.
Often, yes. Their sophisticated knowledge of the environment, their hunting prowess, their agricultural techniques adapted over centuries, their intricate crafts, these were frequently dismissed or simply not recognized as valuable or civilized by European standards. The sources even include some demographic data from around 1820 that helps illustrate the population dynamics at play during this period.
What did the numbers show?
In the USA in 1820, the sources show there were roughly 0.6 million native people compared to about 9 million whites, making a total population just under 12 million. Now contrast that with Spanish America around the same time. The sources list 7.5 million native people versus 3.3 million whites, out of a total population close to 17 million.
Wow, very different ratios. What does that tell us?
It illustrates the different historical trajectories of colonization. While native populations remained a much larger proportion in Spanish America early on, reflecting different patterns of conquest, disease impact, and intermixture, the demographic trend in the USA, with its rapidly growing white settler population, clearly shows the immense pressure for westward expansion and the rapid increasing marginalization of native peoples there. The numbers foretold the conflict to come.
And that displacement just kept rolling westward across North America, didn't it? The sources describe native populations being systematically pushed onto smaller, often less fertile, less desirable parcels of land designated as reservations.
This process was frequently enforced by military action. The sources specifically mention U.S. Army campaigns occurring between 1865 and 1890, basically, continuous warfare against tribes who resisted removal and the theft of their lands in the West.
And this wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Sources mention Canada, too.
No, similar patterns occurred north of the border. The sources highlight the Red River Rebellion, involving the Metis people, a distinct indigenous group with mixed First Nations and European ancestry. They resisted the Canadian government's expansion into their territory in what is now Manitoba between 1869 and 1885.
And there was specific legislation.
Yes. The sources note the Canadian Indian Act of 1876. This was a hugely significant piece of legislation. It consolidated federal control over virtually all aspects of the lives of First Nations peoples, defining who was legally considered an Indian, imposing strict regulations on reserves, undermining traditional governance structures, and aiming for assimilation. Its impacts are still felt profoundly today.
The environmental devastation linked to this expansion is also flagged in the sources, particularly the fate of the bison.
Yes, the near extermination of the vast bison herds by around 1890 is presented as a devastating consequence of westward expansion.
Was it deliberate?
In some cases, yes, it was a deliberate military tactic to deprive Plains tribes of their primary food source and force them onto reservations. But it was also just a direct result of the sheer scale of hunting by settlers, hide hunters supplying eastern markets, and the general disruption of their habitat by railways and settlements. As the sources explain, the bison were absolutely central not just for food, but for shelter, clothing, tools, spiritual practices to the entire way of life for many Plains tribes.
So destroying the bison was destroying their culture.
In large part, yes. It made their traditional way of life impossible, forcing dependence on government rations on the reservations. A calculated blow.
And then there's something seemingly simple, but the sources highlight it as having a fundamental impact. Barbed wire, introduced in 1873.
It sounds mundane, doesn't it? But it prevented the free movement of both the remaining buffalo and the native peoples who traditionally followed them. It cut off access to vital hunting grounds, water sources, and sacred sites. It ruthlessly imposed the European concept of exclusive private land ownership onto a landscape that had always been understood and used communally. It literally carved up the plains, making the old ways impossible.
So the sources give us this really comprehensive, though often grim, picture. The mechanisms of displacement in North America, clashing land views, broken treaties, forced removals like the Trail of Tears, military campaigns, environmental destruction like the bison slaughter, and even technological changes like barbed wire, all cementing the loss of land and traditional ways of life.
What a multi-pronged assault, really.
But as you mentioned, the sources also hint at the beginnings of resistance, the seeds of movements for rights, which we need to come back to later.
A struggle that was just beginning and continues to this day.
Okay, now let's pivot and turn our attention to Australia. The sources present a history that, in many ways, echoes the themes we've just discussed in the Americas, but with its own distinct characteristics, its own timeline. Human habitation in Australia goes back even further. The sources note over 40,000 years.
40,000 years minimum, maybe much longer. Deep, deep time, connected to New Guinea in the past. And like North America in the late 18th century when Europeans arrived in force, it was a continent of incredible linguistic and cultural diversity. The sources estimate somewhere between 350 and 750 distinct languages were spoken.
Again, hundreds of languages, just underscores the diversity.
An ancient and incredibly rich, complex cultural landscape. The native inhabitants are generally referred to in the sources using the term Aborigines.
European arrival, the sources track that too.
Yes, starting with Dutch explorers like Willem Jan Zoon sighting the coast in 1606, and then Abel Tasman reaching what he named Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, in 1642. But the really pivotal moment for sustained European colonization, according to the sources, was Captain James Cook's voyage along the east coast and his landing at Botany Bay in 1770.
And Cook's reports basically paved the way for the British to establish their first permanent settlement, a penal colony in Sydney in 1788. That's the start date for colonization proper.
That's the beginning of the permanent British presence. The sources note that, similar perhaps to some early North American encounters, initial interactions were sometimes recorded as friendly or cautious. However, this quickly deteriorated, leading to what the sources call a sharp reversal of feeling.
Why the reversal?
Well, it's interesting how the sources frame it. They mention Captain Cook's death, which actually happened much later, in Hawaii at the hands of natives there.
Not in Australia.
No, not in Australia. But the sources suggest this event, happening elsewhere, was subsequently used by colonists back in Australia as a kind of justification for their own violence and aggression towards Aboriginal Australians, helping to paint them as inherently treacherous or dangerous.
Wow, so using an event from thousands of miles away to justify actions locally, that's quite a distortion.
It shows how narratives were constructed to serve the colonists' agenda of taking control and land. The sources include a description of the Sydney area from 1790, just 2 years after the first fleet arrived, which is quite revealing about the immediate impact.
What does it say?
This passage, attributed in the sources to P. Grimshaw and others, details the immediate effects: the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their land, and the violent behavior of the newcomers that accompanied it. There is a phrase, 1,000 hungry mouths, which vividly captures the sudden pressure the incoming Europeans, convicts, and their guards initially placed on the local environment and food resources.
And how did the Europeans view the natives' activities?
The sources describe the European perspective at the time, observing Aboriginal people's activities like digging holes, perhaps for yams or shelter, building structures maybe related to ceremonies or resource management, but interpreting these through a lens of fear and otherness. Business with natives was considered inherently dangerous, and kidnapping of Aboriginal people is explicitly mentioned as a tactic used by the colonists.
Kidnapping. Why?
Perhaps to try and force communication, or maybe just to remove individuals perceived as obstacles or threats. It highlights the profound misunderstanding, the fear, and the readiness of the colonists to resort to violence and abduction to clear the land they wanted.
And the overall impact of this arrival, this dispossession and violence.
Devastating, absolutely catastrophic, as documented clearly in the sources.
How bad was it?
The sources state that within just 100 to 150 years of European settlement beginning, nearly 90% of the native population died.
90%. That's almost unimaginable. A demographic collapse.
On a horrific scale. The sources attribute this massive loss of life to a combination of factors hitting simultaneously. First, the introduction of European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which Aboriginal peoples had absolutely no prior exposure or immunity. These swept through communities with deadly effect.
Okay, disease. What else?
Then there was direct, violent conflict as Aboriginal people resisted the invasion and takeover of their lands and waters. Frontier violence was endemic. And finally, the direct consequences of losing their land itself, being driven off hunting grounds, losing access to water sources, sacred sites disrupted, traditional economies shattered, leading to starvation, malnutrition, and social breakdown.
It's a grim combination. And the sources also mention the type of early British settlers being significant. The convicts.
Yes, the sources point out that many of the early arrivals, including convicts who later gained their freedom, had no intention of ever returning to Britain. Unlike some colonial officials who might have seen their posting as temporary, these settlers were there to stay.
What difference did that make?
It meant they were deeply invested in establishing a new life and a new economy in Australia, and they aggressively took land for farming, grazing, and other purposes, generally without any recognition of Aboriginal people's prior ownership, connection, or rights to that land. They were building a permanent new society directly on top of, and at the expense of, the ancient one they were displacing.
The economy that developed subsequently was based on.
Initially, vast sheep farming for wool exports became huge. Later, major mining discoveries, gold rushes, other minerals, and large-scale wheat cultivation, building an economy based on exploiting the continent's resources.
And the capital city, Canberra, established in 1911. There's an interesting linguistic note there, too.
Yes, similar to the Canada example, the sources note that Canberra is derived from Canberra, a local Ngunnawal Aboriginal word thought to mean meeting place.
Another layer of irony, perhaps, naming the capital built on dispossession after an indigenous term for coming together.
It's certainly a poignant detail. The sources also briefly touch on labor practices. They note that Aboriginal people were sometimes employed, particularly in the pastoral industry, but were treated very differently from white workers, often unpaid or paid only in rations, controlled through exploitative systems. Not chattel slavery in the same way as in the Americas, but certainly not free or equal labor.
And other groups faced discrimination, too.
Yes, the sources mention that Chinese immigrants who came often for the gold rushes also provided cheap labor and faced significant racism and discrimination, similar to experiences in places like California around the same time.
Which ties into the White Australia policy.
Exactly. The sources mention the White Australia policy, which was a set of government policies enacted from Federation in 1901 onwards, specifically designed to restrict non-European immigration, particularly from Asia and the Pacific Islands. The aim was to keep Australia white and British. This policy remained largely in effect until the 1970s, shaping the country's demographics and identity for decades, though the sources do note some shifts later, with Asian immigrants being allowed entry by 1974.
So this broader exclusionary policy really highlights the racialized nature of the Australian nation being built on that foundation of indigenous dispossession.
But perhaps one of the most deeply painful and damaging aspects of this history, which the sources specifically detail, is the policy that created what are now known as the stolen generations.
Can you explain what that refers to?
This refers to the long-standing, systematic, government-sanctioned practice, lasting well into the 20th century, of forcibly removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, particularly those of mixed descent, from their families, communities, and culture.
Why were they removed? What was the justification?
It was a deliberate policy aimed at assimilation. It was based on the deeply racist and misguided assumption that these children would be better off if they were raised in white institutions or fostered with white families, completely severed from their Aboriginal heritage, language, and kinship ties. The idea was to essentially breed out Aboriginality over generations.
That's horrifying.
It caused immense trauma, loss, and cultural disruption that continues to affect individuals, families, and communities today. The sources mention that, alongside this history, agitation grew over time for recognition of the deep spiritual bonds Aboriginal peoples have with their sacred lands, their country, and also increasing calls for a formal public apology from the government regarding these terrible past injustices, especially the removal of children.
So pulling it together for both the Americas and Australia, the sources document this stark pattern. European arrival driven by economic needs and a fundamentally different view of land, leading to systematic displacement, horrific violence, devastating population loss due to disease and conflict, and the imposition of entirely new social and economic systems built, quite literally, on the ruins of indigenous societies.
Yes. And while the specific mechanisms differed, you had treaty processes, however flawed, often used in North America, whereas Australia was founded on the legal fiction of terra nullius, land belonging to nobody.
Right. We need to talk more about that.
The ultimate outcome for the indigenous populations across these continents, as depicted in the sources, was remarkably similar in its destructiveness and dispossession.
But importantly, the story presented in the sources doesn't end there, with just oppression and loss. It also details the emergence and the slow, painstaking growth of resistance, of movements fighting back, fighting for recognition, for rights, for self-determination. The sources look at different paths to modernization and also the challenges to imperial power.
Indeed. It's crucial to see both sides. The sources note that while industrialization and the paths to modernization adopted by countries like the USA, Germany, Japan, and Britain brought undeniably significant economic growth and technological advancement.
The upside, supposedly.
Right. But it also came with immense human and environmental costs, even within those industrializing nations. Poor, often brutal labor conditions were absolutely rife in early industrial centers. Epidemics, cholera, typhoid spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary urban slums, and pollution caused widespread illness and environmental damage. The sources give specific examples like cadmium and mercury poisoning incidents in Japan linked to industrial discharge.
So modernization, in that Western industrial sense, wasn't some clean, utopian ideal, even for those supposedly benefiting most. It came with a very heavy price tag.
A critical point the sources make: modernization had its internal victims too. And importantly, the sources make it clear that this era wasn't just defined by powerful imperial nations acting upon passive others. Colonial exploitation, the sources state quite forcefully, was almost everywhere met with resistance. And this resistance often coalesced and found expression in nationalist movements.
Okay, nationalism. How do the sources define that?
Nationalism is presented here as a doctrine centered on popular sovereignty. The core idea is that legitimate political power resides with the people of the nation, not in foreign rulers, colonial administrators, or even hereditary monarchs. Power should come from the governed.
And the sources mention different types of nationalism.
Yes, they distinguish between two main forms that emerged. On the one hand, you have civic nationalism. This defines the nation based on shared citizenship, common laws, and political participation, regardless of ethnicity, language, or religion. In theory, it's an inclusive model. If you're a citizen, you belong.
Okay, civic nationalism and the other type.
The other is ethnic or religious nationalism. This defines the nation based on a shared characteristic like common language, perceived ethnicity, or religion. While this can be a powerful unifying force, the sources note it could also lead to the exclusion and discrimination of minority groups within the state's borders who don't fit that dominant ethnic or religious definition.
Any examples given?
Germany, particularly in reaction to Napoleonic French occupation in the early 19th century, is provided as an example where a form of ethnic nationalism, emphasizing shared German language and culture, gained prominence as a unifying force against foreign rule.
Right. So nationalism arises often in response to outside forces. The sources then look at how specific countries outside Europe and North America navigated this complex path towards modernization, often while still under the shadow of imperialism or dealing with its legacy. India, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the sources indicate they all took quite distinct paths.
Absolutely. Japan is highlighted for its remarkably rapid industrialization and development, particularly its stunning post-World War II economic recovery. But the sources are careful to contextualize this. They note it wasn't some overnight miracle pulled out of thin air.
It built on earlier foundations.
Exactly. It was built upon significant industrial, educational, and institutional gains that Japan had already made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, partly by selectively adopting and adapting Western models while maintaining strong state control. However, the sources also point out that Japan wasn't internally monolithic. It grappled with intense internal tensions between different visions for its future, including struggles between democracy and rising militarism, and there was also significant cultural resistance to aspects of Westernization, even as it embraced Western technology and systems.
A complex internal picture, too. What about China? Its story of modernization, as presented in the sources, seems deeply intertwined with that long, bitter struggle against foreign exploitation and imperialism we discussed earlier.
It absolutely is. The sources describe how resistance to foreign domination came from various levels of Chinese society. You had efforts by the traditional bureaucratic elite, the mandarins, trying to strengthen the king's state through reforms, sometimes called self-strengthening. But you also had massive peasant mobilizations, like a Taiping Rebellion or the Boxer Uprising, driven by economic hardship, social disruption, and strong anti-foreign sentiment.
So resistance from both the top and the bottom.
Yes. And then the sources discuss the rise of modern nationalist movements. The nationalists associated with figures like Sun Yat-sen are highlighted. Their aims included overthrowing the weakened Qing dynasty, kicking out foreign imperialism, and establishing a modern republic with greater equality.
And eventually the Communist Party came to power.
Right. The sources trace how the Chinese Communist Party, under Mao Zedong, eventually defeated the nationalists after World War II, establishing the People's Republic in 1949. And then, in a really striking historical turn decades later, the sources note how the CCP, particularly under Deng Xiaoping, reinvented itself by incorporating market principles into its socialist system, unleashing incredible economic growth and transforming China into the global economic powerhouse it is today. A path to modernization vastly different from the capitalist West, born out of its own unique, tumultuous history, ideology, and resistance to earlier exploitation.
It really shows that modernization wasn't just a single template imposed by Europe. It was actively shaped, resisted, adapted, and reinvented according to local histories, cultures, and struggles.
Definitely not a one-size-fits-all process.
And the period after World War II, the sources note, saw a massive acceleration in these global shifts. The winds of change, as Harold Macmillan famously called it. Decolonization movements gained unstoppable momentum across Asia and Africa. Empires crumbled.
This global context of challenging colonial power is crucial. And it also intersected significantly with the growing movements for indigenous rights within those countries where European settlers had already established dominance, like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
So connecting the global decolonization wave with the internal struggles of indigenous peoples.
Exactly. The sources track the rise of these indigenous rights movements, particularly gaining strength from the mid-20th century onwards, after decades, even centuries, of profound loss, oppression, and policies aimed at forced assimilation.
In the USA and Canada, the sources mention a specific, pivotal moment around 1928, a report with a rather telling title, The Problem of Indian Administration.
Yes, that report, often called the Miriam Report, was hugely significant. It was an official U.S. government commission study, but its findings were damning. It starkly documented the dire poverty, the appalling health conditions, the inadequate education, and the overall devastating failure of federal policy regarding Native Americans on reservations.
So the government's own report admitted things were disastrous.
Pretty much. It provided undeniable official evidence of the terrible consequences of past policies like forced assimilation and land allotment. It couldn't be easily ignored, and it spurred serious calls for reform from both within and outside the government.
And following that report, the sources note the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. What did that do?
The IRA, sometimes called the Indian New Deal, represented a significant, albeit controversial, shift in U.S. policy. As the sources mention, it aimed to reverse key aspects of the previous assimilation policies, which had actively sought to break up tribal lands and destroy tribal governance. The 1934 Act encouraged tribes to establish their own elected governments, write constitutions, and manage their internal affairs. Crucially, it halted the disastrous policy of allotting tribal lands to individuals, a policy that had led to massive land loss, and in some cases, it provided funds to actually buy back land and return it to tribal control.
So a move away from assimilation towards self-determination.
That was the stated goal. While its implementation was complex and its effects debated, the sources present it as a key legislative step towards restoring some degree of tribal sovereignty and self-government, showing that decades of native resistance to forced assimilation were finally beginning to have some impact on federal policy.
But the struggle wasn't over. Assimilationist ideas didn't just disappear, did they? The sources mention resistance continuing, like a Declaration of Indian Rights in 1954.
No, the pendulum swung back in the post-war era. The 1950s saw a renewed push from Congress towards what was called termination policy. The goal was to terminate the federal government's trust relationship with tribes, abolish reservations, and essentially force Native Americans to assimilate fully into mainstream society, ending their distinct political status.
So back towards assimilation again.
Exactly. And this 1954 declaration, issued by the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, was a direct, powerful response to this termination threat. Native leaders from across the country came together and forcefully rejected the entire concept of termination. They reaffirmed their inherent right to maintain their sovereign status, their treaties, their lands, and their distinct communities, as the sources document. It was a major moment of collective indigenous political action.
And we see a similar dynamic in Canada. A government proposal in 1969 to basically abolish treaties met with strong opposition.
Very similar pushback. In 1969, the Canadian government under Pierre Trudeau issued a white paper proposing to eliminate the Indian Act, abolish existing treaties, and essentially treat Indigenous peoples as just another ethnic minority, effectively ending their unique constitutional status and rights.
How was that received?
It was met with incredibly strong, unified opposition from First Nations leaders across Canada. They saw it as the ultimate assimilationist policy, a final attempt to erase their distinct identity and rights. The backlash was so intense that the government was forced to withdraw the white paper
A
proposal.
major victory for indigenous resistance there.
Absolutely. And the sources show this powerful resistance had significant long-term effects. It energized Indigenous political organizing in Canada and contributed directly to the process that eventually culminated in the 1982 Constitution Act.
What was significant about that act?
The 1982 Constitution Act is hugely important because, for the first time, it constitutionally recognized and affirmed the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. It didn't define precisely what all those rights were, that's been the subject of court cases ever since, but it provided a crucial legal and constitutional foundation for the ongoing struggle for self-government, land rights, and cultural preservation. The sources highlight that in both the USA and Canada, while the fight is far from over, significant progress, hard-won through persistent struggle, has been made in regaining rights and reclaiming sacred lands.
Okay, let's shift back to Australia. The movement for indigenous rights also gained momentum there, as the sources indicate, but perhaps a bit later, really taking off from the 1960s and 70s onwards.
Yes, the trajectory was somewhat different, partly because of that unique legal history we touched on terra nullius. But key figures and events really began to challenge the status quo and break the silence. The sources mention the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner and his incredibly influential 1968 Boyer Lectures for the ABC, titled After the Dreaming. In these lectures, he spoke powerfully about the Great Australian Silence.
The Great Australian Silence, what did he mean by that?
He meant the historical amnesia, the pervasive lack of acknowledgement of Aboriginal people, their history, their perspectives, their suffering within mainstream Australian society, and its telling of its own national story. It was a profound critique of the nation effectively ignoring its own past.
And the work of historians like Henry Reynolds.
Also crucial, the sources mention Reynolds, particularly his groundbreaking book, The Other Side of the Frontier, though the source summary mentions Why Weren't We Told?, another impactful work. His research meticulously documented the forgotten history of the Australian frontier, the violence, the massacres, but also the widespread and varied forms of Aboriginal resistance to invasion. It directly challenged the prevailing, sanitized narrative of peaceful settlement and revealed a much darker, more contested history, demanding that Australians confront what had actually happened.
So these academic and public intellectual interventions helped break that silence.
They were hugely important in doing so. And the sources note other shifts happening too. Museums began to slowly change how they represented Aboriginal cultures, moving away from just primitive artifacts towards showcasing living cultures and histories. Efforts were made to record oral histories and life stories, finally acknowledging the value and existence of these long-suppressed perspectives and experiences.
But Australia still faced that massive legal hurdle you mentioned. The doctrine of terra nullius. Can you explain that again? It seems so central to the Australian situation.
It really is. Terra nullius is Latin for land belonging to nobody. As the sources explain, this was the specific legal justification the British used when they claimed sovereignty over Australia in 1788. British law at the time held that if a land was deemed uninhabited, or crucially, not cultivated or possessed in a way Europeans recognized, then the Crown could automatically acquire sovereignty and ownership of all the land upon arrival.
But Australia wasn't uninhabited.
Of course not. It had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years by hundreds of distinct nations with their own complex laws, customs, land management systems, and deep spiritual connection to country. But because these didn't involve fences, deeds, or European-style farming, the British deemed the land legally empty. This legal fiction meant that, unlike in North America, where treaties, however unfair, were sometimes made, in Australia, Aboriginal people were considered to have no legal rights to their land whatsoever under British law from the moment of invasion. Their prior ownership was simply erased.
That's a fundamentally different starting point. How was it overturned?
It took a landmark, hard-fought court case, which the sources highlight as absolutely pivotal, the Mabo case, decided by the High Court of Australia in 1992.
Mabo. Who was involved?
Eddie Koiki Mabo, along with several other plaintiffs from the Murray Islands, Mur in the Torres Strait, challenged the legality of terra nulliuses right up to Australia's highest court. They argued that their traditional land ownership laws and customs had continued uninterrupted despite the arrival of the British.
And the court agreed.
Yes. In a historic decision, the High Court rejected the doctrine of terra nullius as a legal basis for claiming Australia. The court ruled, based on the specific evidence presented about Miriam law and custom, that native title, the recognition of traditional rights and interests in land according to indigenous law, could indeed exist and had survived the assertion of British sovereignty, provided that connection to the land had been maintained and not extinguished by subsequent government acts.
So it didn't grant lands back everywhere, but it threw out the foundation of terra nullius.
Exactly. It declared the original premise of settlement that the land belonged to no one legally invalid. As the sources explain, this fundamentally changed Australian law. It recognized that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples did have prior rights, opening the door for Indigenous groups across the country to lodge claims for legal recognition of their native title rights over traditional lands and waters. A monumental shift.
And finally, that deeply painful issue of the stolen generations, was that formally addressed?
Yes. After decades of activism and campaigning by survivors and their families, the sources detail that a major national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families was conducted in 1995. Its findings were presented in a powerful report called Bringing Them Home in 1997.
What did the report find?
It meticulously documented the widespread, systematic, and often brutal nature of the child removal policies across Australia, spanning many decades. It detailed the devastating intergenerational trauma caused by forcibly separating children from their families, culture, land, and identity. The report made strong recommendations, including the need for a national apology.
And did an apology happen?
Following the report and continued public pressure, the sources note that in 1999, the Australian Parliament formally established National Sorry Day, held annually on May 26th, and issued a motion of reconciliation which included an apology for the injustices suffered by the stolen children and their families, acknowledging the profound grief, suffering, and loss caused by past government policies. It was a hugely significant, though for many, long overdue step in the national reconciliation process, documented right here in our sources.
Okay, so stepping back and looking at everything we've unpacked from these sources, they really paint this incredibly complex, deeply interconnected global picture, don't they? Spanning continents, spanning centuries. We see these powerful forces of European industrialization and expansion driven by a very specific economic and cultural mindset,
That commodity view.
crashing head-on into hundreds of incredibly diverse indigenous cultures around the world, each with vastly different worldviews, especially concerning land and relationship to place.
And we see the sheer variety of methods that imperial powers use to exert control and exploit resources. Everything from direct rule and administration to settler colonialism built on convenient legal fictions like terra nullius's,
Right.
all the way to more indirect forms of influence using economic leverage or political manipulation to create semi-colonies that were nominally independent but effectively controlled.
But, and this is so crucial, the sources make it absolutely clear that this wasn't just a passive process of victims and aggressors. There was resistance everywhere.
Constant resistance.
We see the rise of nationalism in colonized nations fighting for sovereignty, and perhaps most relevant to our core theme, the emergence and persistence of these determined, growing indigenous rights movements, fighting specifically to reclaim what was stolen or denied: land, rights, language, culture, dignity, self-determination.
And those timelines included in the source material really help you see the global connections, don't they? How events over in Europe, things like the French Revolution spreading ideas of rights, or the Industrial Revolution creating demand, or major wars shifting power balances had direct ripple effects. They influenced the timing, the intensity, the location of colonization efforts.
And in turn, that shaped the nature and timing of resistance movements and the different paths countries took towards trying to modernize or decolonize on the other side of the world. It's all linked.
It really is.
So this deep dive into this rich source material, it's given us a challenging, sometimes very difficult, but absolutely vital view of global history from roughly 1700 to 2000. It shows, undeniably, how that relentless drive towards modernization, as defined and propelled by European expansion and a particular economic mindset, led to immense disruption, violence, displacement, and cultural loss for indigenous peoples across the entire
The
planet.
human cost was staggering.
But it also clearly documents their resilience, their multifaceted resistance, and the long, arduous, ongoing journey towards reclaiming their rights, their history, and their heritage. A struggle that continues in many forms today.
And if we connect this history, all these details from the sources, to the bigger picture, it really compels us, doesn't it, to ask a fundamental question. When we talk about modernization, when we evaluate historical progress, whose perspective are we actually using?
What do you mean?
Well, is progress solely measured by economic growth statistics, industrial capacity, the power of the nation state? Or does a true, honest understanding require us to grapple fully with the human cost involved, the destruction of established, sustainable ways of life, the immense environmental impact, the violation of the rights and sovereignty of those who were displaced or assimilated in the name of that progress?
It's a critical question, isn't it? What gets counted and what gets ignored when we tell the story of modernization? It definitely lingers, that question. It demands that we look critically at how history is often told and maybe question what values we prioritize when we use a word like progress. That's a powerful thought to carry with you.
Indeed. The sources lay out the historical facts, the different perspectives, the consequences, and that question of how we interpret it all, well, that's something for you, the listener, to continue to mull over.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.